I apparently neglected to put a due date on the assignment on Quarkus. It now has one. It is indeed still due on Thursday at midnight, so before it becomes Friday, which is, I believe, the last possible day that I'm allowed to give you a due date for an assignment. So I'm not allowed to give you a due date that goes beyond the end of classes, which is why I chose that day. So far, I've had exactly one person ask for a climate change related extension, which was granted. So just keep that in mind. Got a couple other bits of course business. So this is the last week of class. This is it. We got this class, we got one more class, and we're done. The end. No more COG250 for you, at least. Maybe more for me. Course evaluations are open. Please fill those out. It helps me if you fill those out. Tell me what you thought worked and what you didn't. Were the assignments reasonable? Did the lectures work? That kind of thing. All that feedback is super helpful. So please fill those out. What else we got? These are your tests. Please feel free to grab them. I'll bring them again for the people listening to the recording of this. I'll bring them again on Thursday. And I think what I'll have to do is, because there will be people who don't make it to class, but nonetheless want to pick up their essays, I'll do office hours after classes are over. So next week, I'll do some office hours. I'll put up an announcement on Quarkus about when those are. You'll be welcome to pick up your test if you haven't. You'll also be welcome to come talk to me about stuff like the exam. So like thinking about exam prep and that kind of thing, or anything else that you want to talk about, standard office hours, but after classes are over. So I'll put up an announcement about that. Any other course business, course questions about how we're going to do things going to the end of this thing? Yeah.
Final exam, like the same format?
Yes. So the final exam, I have not yet submitted the final exam. I'm positive that I'm supposed to have done that already, but nobody's complained at me yet. So I have not yet written the final exam, but it will be almost exactly the same structure as test 2. I think what we're going to do is just have a few more short answer questions and an essay question. So that's one of the reasons why I gave you the essay question on test 2, was so that you have some practice, you get some feedback, you know what to expect on the exam. So almost exactly like test 2. Yeah?
Is it like, it's probably more heavily weighted to this material?
Yeah, so it will be heavily weighted towards the end third of the course, but the essay question will be very broad. The essay question, there'll be a selection of short answer and essay questions. The essay question will be like really, I know I've been harping on about the synoptic nature of cognitive science. The essay question will be fairly synoptic. It will be very overarching for the whole course. That'll be the goal anyway. I might throw in a couple of things in the short answer from earlier in the course, but really heavily weighted towards the last third of the course. Just because, yeah, exactly as you say, because we haven't been tested on that yet. Yeah. Any other questions about course business? Okay, let's get into it then. So we've been talking about qualia, the subjective dimension of experience, the fact that it feels like something to be you. And we saw a bunch of arguments that suggested that subjective dimension of experience, the consciousness, is somehow beyond the capacity of any science whatsoever to explain or understand. Those are the arguments for dualism, the arguments like Mary in the Room and the philosophical zombie arguments, that kind of thing. Those are classic arguments in philosophy of mind, and they're worth knowing, they're worth thinking about. But I also started giving you some ways to push back against those arguments. So the philosophical zombie argument is a particularly nice one for understanding the pushback that I'm trying to give you. The p-zombie argument says you could be exactly the way you are but lack subjective experience. And what that argument assumes is that there's nothing that consciousness or qualia add to your capacities. Like they don't do anything for you. You could do everything that you do without them. So if that's right, if that assumption is right, then consciousness, they call it epiphenomenal in philosophy, that it doesn't do anything. Consciousness has no causal role in your cognition. I talked to a few people formulating their essays, and it's probably should have done this distinction earlier, but distinguish for cognition from consciousness. So cognition is things like problem solving, memory, categorization, right? These are skills and abilities that you've got. We can formalize and mechanize a bunch of cognition. The arguments that I gave you were that there's parts of human cognition that we can't formalize and mechanize just yet. Stuff like insight, problem solving, framing, that kind of thing. So think of cognition as a set of skills, a set of abilities that you've got. And consciousness is separate. Consciousness is, or at least this argument suggests, consciousness is entirely separate. It's subjective experience. It feels like something to be you, right? So we've been trying to pull apart this notion of consciousness in the last part. And the P-zombie argument says you can have all of the cognitive stuff without any of the consciousness. Now, last time we talked a little bit about computational functionalism, which is it's a story about the mind-brain relationship, and we're kind of causing problems for it. We're causing problems for computational functionalism, but also trying to get at some of the character of what makes your qualia the way they are. So I made the argument, for example, that so some of the arguments that we looked at were against computational functionalism, that is that this view that minds are software and brains are hardware, and software in a very literal sense, like computational functionalism. The computation part of that is the version of computation that we talked about from GoFi. So formal rules, sort of formal rules operating on tokens in a purely formal fashion. So that's the computational functionalist view. Really hard to see how you get qualia out of that, isn't it? So like it has a really hard time dealing with the explanatory gap. And so many of the arguments that function for dualism also function against computational functionalism. But we also last time started thinking about maybe what kind of role qualia could play in our actual cognitive economy. That is, I started trying to make the case that if we think about qualia in terms of meaning something to us, that we could actually understand in some sense how subjective experience plays a cognitive role, such that consciousness and cognition are not cleanly separable in that way. So some of the things that you do cognitively are being embodied, and that's what we talked a lot about, sensory motor subjectivity. So the ability to move through your environment, use your body to accomplish your goals, those are cognitive in the sense that they are skills and abilities that you've got. And the arguments that we looked at from the embodied mind hypothesis last time tried to show at least somewhat that the quality of your subjective experience depends on its relationship to your embodiment and your ability to not only receive information, but to act in the world. And that when you got the right kind of sensory motor loops in the world, you could actually transform the character of your subjective experience. You could, for example, have electrical stimulation of your tongue turn into a quasi-visual experience with tactile sensory substitution, which is something you really wouldn't expect, right? You wouldn't expect your zapping your tongue to generate visual experience, but the thinking about subjective experience in terms of relative to you as agent in the world, it starts to make a little bit of sense. So maybe we can unravel some of the character of subjective experience in terms of embodiment, and embodiment as an agent in the world who's trying to do stuff. So maybe that's part of the picture. Today and tomorrow, we're going to start to unpack the other half of this, which is meaning something. Meaning something. That is, your subjective experience, here's one of the most important things about it, is that it's gripping to you in some way, that it matters to you, it's significant to you. Your subjective experience has relevance for you. And that's something, if that's part of what makes your subjective experience the way it is, then it's not hard to see why computational functionalism would fail to be able to explain it, because nothing matters to a computer. Computers don't care about the information that they're processing in any important sense that we know of. Maybe you could build one somehow, but our current picture of how computers work in any GoFi system, they don't care about the information, but you care about your subjective experience. So that's the half we're going to deal with today, the meaning something half. And we'll bring it back to, so I'm going to talk about relevance today, and we'll bring it back to consciousness on Thursday. Yeah.
You had mentioned that, like, for a GoFi system, that it can, does that also include like a connectionist system?
Yeah. So I don't know any sense in which a neural network of the kind that we currently have in AI research cares about the information that it's dealing with. I don't know of any sense in which that's true. Yeah.
Differentiate between caring about certain kind of features inside it versus like actually caring about the information as a whole.
Yeah, so I mean, differentially responding to information is something a neural network can do. Like it picks up on certain features and not on other features. I think that's a stretch to say that it cares about that information. And we'll develop sort of thinking directly about relevance today, and I hope that'll kind of come out as why that's not really, why that neural network doesn't in some deep sense care about the information that it's processing. Okay? Okay. So, at long last, after having kind of dealt with this piecemeal throughout the course, this has been the idea that's been bouncing around throughout the course, and I just want to remind you of some of the places that we saw it, is relevance. And relevance has been kind of screwing us up all along, hasn't it? It's been raining on our parade at every stage of our attempts to understand the mind. So we learned about categorization, and we found that early attempts to understand categorization assumed that relevance was something that you could just give the computer, or that you could just sort of program in as an objective fact. So remember Tversky's model of similarity, where there was a little variable in there, wasn't there? How salient are the features? And that was an unformalized assumption that you know what salience is. We ended up with the microtheory or the theory, and that assumed, again, that you know what's relevant. So you know to generate a theory is precisely to pick out the relevant features of your environment. So again, we got sort of like stuck on this relevant stuff. In memory, we found that our memory is helpful to us precisely by picking out the parts of your experience that are relevant to you. That is, it doesn't just store everything and give you back everything, and that you don't want it to. You don't want to have to sift through literally every piece of information that you've ever passed through your eyeballs and your ears and your skin. You want it to pick out those parts that are going to help you stay alive and thrive and achieve your goals, right? So your memory is reconstructive, and it's reconstructive in a way that picks out the bits of your experience that are relevant for you going forward. So once again, our theories of memory seem to deeply presuppose this notion of relevance. We saw it once again in problem solving. We saw that all of our theories, so the main problem with Newell and Simon's initial attempts to formalize problem solving, their GPS project, was that they thought that you knew what was relevant to problem formulation. So it was assumed that the problems were well formulated, which is to say it's assumed that you already know what the relevant operators are and the relevant sort of search space to be moving through is. When we moved to insight, we found that what we have is this amazing ability to reframe situations, to choose new problem representations, and a problem representation, problem formulation, is in some sense a belief about what's relevant in the situation. So at the core of insight problem solving, we found the ability to recognize and understand what's relevant, and we didn't have a good formal account of it. So again, our attempts to understand problem solving seem to presuppose relevance. We saw it again in GoFi. So in the good old-fashioned AI tradition, and especially in the microworlds tradition. So think about the microworlds, where what they did was build incredibly simple little universes for their good old-fashioned AI programs to run around in. And they were reasonably good at problem solving in those microworlds. But they failed utterly to scale up the complexity of these microworlds, precisely because what they'd done is remove the problem of assessing relevance from the universe of the robot. So they give it a memory that can remember the complete history of every object in its entire universe. So the memory problem is gone. They give it a very constrained number of objects that it has to deal with, so it doesn't have to sort of categorize. And they gave it extremely well-defined problems, so it doesn't have to do problem formulation. What they did was, in some sense, remove the problem of relevance from the world of the robot. And when you do that, you can build a robot that fairly successfully navigates the world. But what you've done is remove the hard part of being intelligent, You've removed the most difficult part of being a cognitive agent, which is somehow tracking what's relevant or important. And we saw this once again in the neural networks, in two ways I want to say connectionism sort of had trouble with the relevance problem. So in supervised learning, so when you've got a neural network and you're giving it supervised learning, what you're doing is basically using your ability to understand what's important and teaching it how to mimic your relevance realizing capacity, your ability to pick out what's important. You give it the answer, and sort of by giving it a series of answers, you tell it what's important. And it's good at mimicking your ability to understand what's relevant. But in unsupervised learning, it would have to, like we do, it would have to figure that out for itself. So again, we sort of, in supervised learning, what you do is you remove the problem of relevance from the system. And by removing the problem of relevance, you make the AI effective at its goals, but you make it impossible for it to ever become strong AI. And I would insist that the fact is that all of our neural networks right now are single domain, single problem solvers. So if you train the neural network up for face recognition, it's good at face recognition, bad at chess, and vice versa, of course. So what that tells you is, so remember in the problem solving section, the hard part of problem solving, the really hard part, is figuring out what kind of problem you're facing. You're facing typically intelligent agents face ill-defined problems. Most of your problems are ill-defined, and a single domain neural network is good at one type of problem. But what we've taken away from it is the sort of meta problem of figuring out what sort of problem it's facing. So neural networks really don't solve the frame problem, they avoid it. Just like microworlds did, just like GoFi did. They avoid it by only being given the kinds of tasks that it's designed for, whereas we general problem solvers have to figure out what kind of task we're facing, rather than just having it handed to us. Which is why courses like this are so frustrating, because I'm like, write an essay, good luck, which is an unbelievably ill-defined problem, and that's not an accident. I mean, I hope I've given you an argument for why that's the right kind of training for you to learn deeply, because ill-defined problems are harder to solve, but they're causing you, hopefully, to process information more deeply. That's the hope, anyway. Okay, so that was just a really brief, the whole course in review, basically. So relevance as it appeared throughout the whole course, and the whole time it's been messing us up. It's been this, like, anytime I said the word relevance, a kind of groan goes over the crowds. They're like, oh, here we go again. Here we go, we're gonna wreck the theory. It looks pretty good. Relevance is gonna be the iceberg that sinks this ship once again. It's gonna be a train wreck because relevance is this unaccounted for thing. So maybe the thing to do, rather than just constantly be frustrated by the problem of relevance, is to turn to face it directly and actually try to solve this by looking at relevance as a criterion of the cognitive. So we've been discussing what would count as what makes a cognitive agent really cognitive rather than just a simulation. What makes an intelligent agent really intelligent rather than a simulation of intelligence. Maybe it's the capacity to realize relevance, to figure out what's relevant in the scenario. So that's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about attempts to come up with a theory of relevance in cognitive science. That's our goal. Okay? Yeah, so this stuff. So the hard part here is that it's super hard to come up with, to pre-specify what's relevant. I mean, I invite you to try. Like what, can you come up with a general description of what makes something relevant without just you giving me a synonym for relevant? It's hard. It is genuinely hard. Doesn't mean you can't take a shot at it. Take a shot at it. Yeah, yeah.
The complexity of what you were considering does not exceed the amount of available computational resources.
Okay.
Currently on the system.
Okay. So it's relevant if the complexity is small enough that you can handle it with your sources. That actually might be a decent, well, it might be a necessary condition on what's relevant, but in another sense, so sometimes the most relevant things are the things that you can't handle. So like the world, many of the problems that people face are like so complex that we can't even begin to deal with them. That doesn't really make them unimportant or not relevant. That just makes them scary and difficult to deal with. So maybe, but that, I mean, sort of like you should focus in on things that you can handle, maybe. That doesn't seem like a terrible part of the, but it's part of the story, right? That's, at best, that's part of the story of relevance. Yeah?
Things that affect your survival.
Things that affect your survival, yeah. So that's a potentially good, necessary, well, so you don't just pay attention to things that affect your survival though, right? So sometimes I read a book that's not about how not to die. It's one of my favorite pastimes is to, and this is, I mean, it could be the case that much of our modern ennui is a result of the fact that our species is tuned up to spend most of its day on survival threats. And I don't know about you, not dying is pretty straightforward for me in 21st century Toronto. Like it's a thing that that's not my, like, when I think about like, how do I succeed at my goals, it's not like, how do I not die? It's more like, how do I flourish and become a famous philosopher or something? I don't know, whatever egocentric sort of like project I'm on that day. So not dying is relevant, but also there are lots of scenarios where humans are perfectly happy to die, or maybe not thrilled, but like we are willing to die for various projects that we think are more relevant than staying alive. Soldiers are a particularly vivid example here. So soldiers go into scenarios where they're fairly confident that there's a good chance they're going to die, but they think actually there's something more important than that. So, yeah.
So is it just something that might have some sort of impact on your goals?
Could be, yeah, could be. Some impact on your goals. Yeah.
And whether it goes like walking down the street to class or, big picture stuff.
Yep. I worry that that's a bit like just saying it's relevant to your goals. There's two ways of going. There's two ways of sort of failing to come up with a theory of relevance. You can either just give me a circular definition, or you can give me something that I think anything else you're going to offer, it's either going to be circular or there's going to be some exception to the rule. Like clearly surviving is important most of the time, but not all of the time. People, yeah.
So like an overall cost-reward balance?
An overall
Like cost-reward balance?
cost-reward balance. Good.
Like dopamine, energy spent.
So I think that's correct, but circular. So in the sense that what counts as a reward? And what counts as a reward is what you care about, right? So some people find very weird things rewarding. Like some people are like really fixated on pinball. They're like amazing at pinball. Some people care so much about making money, I cannot believe it. Some people care so much about being thin, it blows my mind. Like people's goals are so various, and what counts as a goal is determined by what's relevant to you. So I think that falls under the sort of circular side of things. Yeah. This is a trick. It's a trick question. It's a trap. I'm just trying to trick and trap you. But I think it's worth drawing out the ways in which it's super hard to come up to pre-specify what's relevant. We saw this argument before, actually, in some version of this. Basically, what's relevant is more like white things than horses. Remember that argument? That was this stuff about how if you're going to define something scientifically, that is, in general terms, you need to have stable context invariant properties. You need to have properties that are the same across change, right? Horses have a bunch of properties that stay the same across change. They're warm-blooded, they have hooves, they run on four legs. Those are general properties of horses. Not all horses have those properties, but it's a good statistical bet that if somebody tells you, I got a horse here, you're like, I bet it's warm-blooded and has a heart and four legs that end in hooves, right? That's a good statistical guess because they have properties that carry across context that you can generalize about. And if you're good, so white things, on the other hand, basically all you can say about them is that they're white. and maybe that they're things, right? There's not really good generalizations you can make about them. And science needs stable, homogeneous classes. But is the class of relevant things stable? No. You can make things relevant that otherwise totally wouldn't have been. So like chalk. Okay, suddenly I made chalk relevant for you for like half a second, right? Because not for any intrinsic property of chalk that you find super interesting, but just because it was like the subject of conversation. So you can make things relevant or irrelevant. The relevance of anything really depends on the context, and there doesn't seem to be any context-insensitive facts about what's relevant. So relevance, the suggestion might be, is more like white things than horses. It's like things that happen on Tuesday the 14th, right? There's no context invariant facts about things that happen on a Tuesday the 14th. The standard example here is actually Mondays, things that happen on Monday. But I think there are context invariant facts about Mondays. Like you're more likely to have a heart attack on a Monday because Mondays are bad and you have to go to work. That's why, right? So there are general facts about things that happen on a Monday, at least on Earth. But Tuesday the 16th, I don't think so. So yeah.
Almost statistical, you can say like, yeah, there's a likelihood of this happening. There's a 70% chance that people might die on Mondays, but that's
fine.
not a yes or a no answer. It's just like it's happening.
That's
It's not a guarantee.
That's fine. You can do science of things that happen statistically.
Yeah.
I think political science is like this. You can find the odds. Medical science is certainly like this. So like some people smoke their entire lives and are fine, but it increases the likelihood of bad health outcomes if you smoke. And I'm willing to take that one to the bank. That's solid science. We learned something, but it's not a guarantee. It's about statistics. Evolutionary biology is also statistical in nature. So it doesn't have to be yes or no. Just having, like, not all horses have 4 legs either. Not all horses have 4 hooves. Some horses are, did you know that something like 1 in 10,000 cats are born with 6 legs? It's true facts. So the generalization cats have 4 legs is, pretty good, but not by no means universal. So, but that's enough for us to do science about it. Whereas relevance itself doesn't look like you can do science about it. This is a paper by Dan Chiappi and John Verveake, and they basically argue, they do argue that relevance is the core of cognition, of human level cognition, the argument that I've been making this whole class. You can't have a science of relevance, therefore, you can't have a science of cognition. So go home and do something more important with your life. Go take up a trade or something, or like learn to program, I don't know. Like the conclusion of this paper was you're not gonna get a science of cognition. Not a complete science anyway, because I hope I've made the case that relevance is important to cognition. They regard this stuff about, so their argument is basically drawing on Fodor arguments that we've talked about before, about how, precisely about how cognition is sensitivity to context. Human level cognition is sensitivity to context. We need context insensitive things to do science, therefore no science of cognition. And he really, so I've talked to John about this, he really got depressed, actually, having written that. So this is shortly before his PhD dissertation was finished. And he's like, darn, the project is doomed. There's no way of doing a science of the mind. Yeah.
Doesn't he bring up that it's like compartmentalized, that it's like its own thing that you might be able to separate in some sense, or that the emotions that give rise to relevance might be replicable? At the start, he kind of talks like it's like a mixture of different competing elements going on. There's hard kind of problems that are solved.
Yeah. Yeah, so the very end of this paper is argument that it's not like you can't study anything about psychology. So the conclusion is not, there's nothing that we can learn about the mind. That's clearly false, right? I've been telling you things about the mind all the time. I'm sure you know lots of things about the mind independent of this course. Like, the conclusion is not that you can't ever learn anything about the mind, but that the kind of core of human level intelligence is permanently beyond science. That was the conclusion. Yeah, so they spend a little bit of time at the end of the paper saying, okay, but that, it's not shut down the psychology department, but it is a deeply pessimistic conclusion. It's an argument for what's, I think we talked about in terms of epistemic closure, right? Or epistemic boundedness, kind of interchangeable terms for the same thing. If you are epistemically bounded with respect to something, you'll just never, ever get it. Cats are epistemically bounded with respect to calculus. There's just nothing you can do with, to, or for a cat that will help it understand calculus. The end. Yeah? You'd have to change it so much that it's no longer a cat. And we accept this about most animals for most things, that there are limits to their ability to understand and grasp things. And then when it comes to us, we're like, no, wait. We're us. We're great. We're not bounded. You can't say that we can't understand something. Geez, that's rude. How dare you? So this was a kind of argument that no, in fact, we are epistemically bounded with respect to this core element of human cognition. So the end. Yeah.
What about relevance to like a goal? Wouldn't you say that relevance to a goal isn't as like infinite in a sense? So if you figure out the intrinsic goals for humans, then you can kind of have a theory of human relevance.
Interesting. So I think that's kind of similar to where I'm going to go from here. So if you say, so okay, good. Shifting the question is precisely the move I think we should make here. So shifting the question to something like not what is relevant full stop. So you're not going to have an answer to the question what is relevant the end, but you can maybe give an answer to what is relevant to you given the kind of person you are and what your goals are. It might not be the case that humans have intrinsic built-in goals that are sort of permanent and fixed, because humans can, again, we're so bizarrely flexible in terms of our goals. Like, I really love oxygen, but there are deep divers who learn to go without it for as long as possible. So our goals are wildly flexible, but you might be able to generate a theory of, given a goal and given a context, how do you figure out what's relevant then? So that's maybe a way of getting out of this. Yeah.
You've used the analogy before of like flights, the engineering end run.
Yeah.
If you look at the Wright brothers, they didn't really have any idea what they were doing, so they just kind of winged it, and then they found a design.
They winged it. Oh, brutal. Okay.
They found a design that more or less worked.
Yeah.
They increased their understanding of it. They don't have a formal definition of it. They don't have an explanation of flight yet. But their understanding at least extends to the point of like, we know what works.
Yep.
Like, using Verveake's idea, like, can we at least kind of say that we can black box it, kind of have a blueprint of what we know what works. That is to some degree understanding something. Like you've got some sense of an understanding.
Like, I mean, so I don't have any argument that that's in principle impossible or in principle unworkable as a strategy. I do have 70 years of people trying it and failing, and very little progress so far. So if I'm right that the neural networks that we've got don't do relevance at all, then we've made zero progress on that in terms of engineering. Now, again, that's not an argument that you can't. It's just an argument that we haven't. So, but let me, so let's give up on coming up with a theory of relevance, because relevance isn't a thing in the world, right? But maybe we can come up with a theory of relevance realization. So let's call the ability to work out what's relevant relevance realization, to realize what's relevant. And maybe you can come up with a theory of that. So that's basically what I'm going to try to motivate now. And it's a kind of subtle, but I think really important shift in the project. And let me give you an analogy to try to illustrate the nature of the shift and why it's important, why it might be helpful. So I'm going to do a bunch of stuff today about evolution. So here's an analogy between relevance and fitness. So fitness in the evolutionary sense is just the likelihood that you're going to get your genes into the next generation, basically. So ask yourself, is there something that is a context invariant thing that makes somebody fitter? Like what is fitness? Is it being fast? This sloth is very, very slow. So for some animals, being fast is fitness. For a cheetah, that's part of the fitness of the animal. For a sloth, not so much. Having dangerous and mighty jaws is for many animals but again, the sloth is that's not the game he's playing, right? Being large, well, no, many animals are fit because they're small. So being small gives you all kinds of advantages in some contexts. There's nothing context invariant that makes you fitter. Yeah?
But like viable gametes.
What's that?
Viable gametes.
Lots and lots of animals don't have that. So almost no ants or bees have viable gametes, but they're unbelievably successful. They're some of the most successful animals on the planet. Yeah, yeah. So yeah, you personally getting your genes into the next generation has, for many, many animals, nothing to do with fitness. Contributing to the success of your species is the thing that is correlated with fitness. So, Darwin did not come up with a theory of fitness. Darwin at no point in his work wrote down, here's what makes an animal fit. That's not the kind of theory that he came up with, right? The theory of evolution by natural selection is not a theory about fitness. It's a theory about how species stay fitted to their environment, right? It's a theory about how, over time, species can remain fitted given an environment. That's the theory of natural selection. There's no, I guarantee, I read Darwin, there's no list in Darwin that says here's what you need to be fit. And that changes radically across contexts. Life is amazingly good at finding new ways of being fit. So this is the suggestion, is that we should come up with a theory like evolution by natural selection, which, rather than a theory of fitness, we should come up with a theory of fittedness. Rather than a theory of relevance, we should come up with a theory of relevance realization, how the dynamical constraints on the system keep it tracking what's relevant in a context. So that's what the theory of natural selection is, right? So you've got in the theory of natural selection a couple of dynamical constraints. It's actually a perfect dynamical theory in the rich sense that I developed earlier in the dynamical systems area, right? So in that sense, there's the using differential equations version of dynamical systems, but there's also the having a theory about the dynamical constraints on the system, right? So and about generating and constraining possibilities. So natural selection is a kind of constraint on the possibilities for biological form. If you have a form that doesn't let you survive in your environment, then you get naturally selected. So lots and lots of biological forms are ruled out because they are not fitted to their environment. That's a sort of like constraint that reduces the possibilities. Mutation and sexual recombination generate a bunch of new possibilities. So we've got a system that's generating a bunch of possibilities and a system that's constraining the possibilities, mutually dynamically informing each other over time. That's the theory of natural selection. It's a theory of how these constraints play off each other to keep the system at every moment fitted to its environment. Okay? And basically, that's going to be the structure of the theory of relevance realization. I think that we're just trying to narrow in on what kind of theory we're looking for. I would suggest, and Verveake suggests, this is the kind of theory that you need. So you need a theory that, in some sense, doesn't try to pin down what's relevant, but the dynamical constraints that the system is using is playing off of each other to continue to track what's relevant across time. So it's developmental, just like evolution. It's dynamical in the sense of it's a set of constraints that are playing off each other. I haven't told you what the constraints are yet, but just hang on for a minute. I'd also like to point out something pretty fantastic about evolution. So ask yourself, how many factors does evolution take into account? So this is one of the problems with trying to explicitly come up with a theory of relevance realization, right? One of the problems was, of relevance, there's too many things to consider. We kept hitting combinatorial explosion. But does evolution hit combinatorial explosion? Here's a fun example. This is one of my favorite examples of evolution, and it's actually hardware evolution. So what you can do, you got these chips that can rewire themselves, and then you've got sort of a genetic code, so a genetic plan for how the chip is going to rewire itself. And what you do in hardware evolution, or at least what these people did, was have a bunch of different sort of genotypes, that is the plans for how to wire themselves, and you try one, see how well it does. If it does well, it gets into the next generation, gets mutated and maybe combined with another genotype, and then try it and see what happens, and try it and see what happens. And this is a fantastic little paper. It's fascinating what happens when you actually do this in an actual lab, because the number of things that the system takes into account is unlimited. For example, when you actually do this in an actual lab, you get chips that work in ways that nobody would have expected. So the examples here were, they had one, so its task was to just be an oscillator, just maintain a steady frequency, but there's no sort of intrinsic timing built in, so it's kind of a hard task. And they found that their chips would work, so they got some really good chips that would maintain the frequency really reliably until they turned off the soldering iron on the table next to it. It was picking up on something being put out by the soldering iron or by the computers in the next room. So when you shut off the computer in the next room, they were giving off subtle radio frequencies that they didn't think these chips should even be able to pick up. Like, there's no reason electrically why it would have any connection to this that they could think of, but they didn't have to think of it because evolution picks up on everything. Everything in the context is potentially included in what's being selected for. So evolution doesn't deal with combinatorial explosion. It's just the complete context is what determines what's fit or not. They got these chips that, like, I don't think it's in this paper, it's in a different paper about hardware evolution, but there would be like, the most successful versions of some chips would have a bunch of loops that didn't go anywhere. So there'd be like 5 loops that just seemed to go in a little circle. So if you ran it in a simulation, it wouldn't work because these are just utterly, apparently useless little loops that don't go anywhere. But in an actual chip, there are subtle like, so the simulation assumes a chip is either on or off. That's not actually true about real chips. They're kind of in between. They assume that there's no leakage, electrical leakage between the parts. That's not actually true. There's very tiny amounts of leakage. So all of the incredibly subtle stuff that you would never have thought of, that you would never have explicitly represented in the situation, all of that to evolution is actually relevant. That's how we evolve as well. So we are fitted to our actual context in all of its detail, not to some abstract representation of that context. So evolution doesn't face combinatorial explosion. Evolution takes everything into account, or at least natural selection does. So, right, so just to get this analogy, again, what we're doing here is trying to come up with a theory of relevance realization, essentially on the analogy with evolution. So where it's a dynamical theory, it's not trying to pin down what's relevant, it's trying to pin down what the constraints are. And you can explicitly represent the constraints and then say, whatever the context is, these are the constraints that are operating on. Yeah? Okay. So, so far I haven't given you anything like a theory yet. So far I have not even begun to describe the theory. We're just trying to pin down what kind of theory is the right kind of theory. Because we've had so many theories that just absolutely collapsed under the problem of relevance. And I gave you an argument just a few minutes ago that you can never have a theory of relevance, which convinced some people that this is just an impossible task and that actually COG250 is doomed. That was the conclusion, that it's doomed as a project. So it does seem worth sort of really working out what kind of theory could even possibly answer the problem. And that's the argument that I'm trying to do now. Just what kind of theory could possibly answer the problem? Hopefully, it's a theory about relevance realization and the dynamical constraints on a cognitive agent that keeps you realizing what's relevant for your context. Is that really reasonably okay? Okay. Okay, so suppose I've convinced you that what we need is a theory of relevance realization. I made the case very extensively that we need some way of dealing with that relevance is important to cognition. And then I made a brief case based mostly on Jerry Fodor that we can't have a theory of relevance per se. That is, you can't have a theory exactly of relevance. So if we're committed to the idea that we're still going to keep trying to understand the mind, that kind of entails that you need something else. Here's another thing, a theory of relevance realization as a kind of dynamical theory. Okay, so suppose that you agree to all that. Now what do we do? Where should we start on a theory of relevance realization? So let's go through some candidate starting points and knock them down like intellectual bullies, and then we'll get to something that I hope is slightly better. So here's a place that you might start on your theory of relevance realization. Maybe you want to start with representations, meaningful representation. So maybe your theory of relevance realization should go something like this. It should say, look, here are the features of representations that you want to pick out to decide whether they're relevant or not. Here are the constraints on how you should observe, how your mind deals with the representations. And representations here, I again show you the monkey selfie of the macaque. My thought macaque is about the macaque, right? It's about this toothy little fella here. So a representation is about something. It has meaning, it has sense and reference. Those are the things that representations have, right? So maybe that's the level, the meaningful representation level is the right level to start. And you know, I don't know how this would actually work, but you can imagine some kind of theory. Like, here are the features of a given representation that make it more relevant than others. Right? So here's what a representation should have that makes it likely to be relevant. Okay, so one possible starting point for a theory of relevance realization. Here's an argument why that's not going to work. And it more or less comes from I have a hard time remembering which philosophers are disgraced. I think John Searle's disgraced now for being a bad person. I can't remember. Okay, yeah, so I'm seeing nods. Yeah, so the now disgraced John Searle gives the following argument. So about representations, which as far as I can tell, doesn't fall because he's a bad person. So representations, he says, are aspectual. They're always aspectual. So when you represent something, here's what it means. They have, he says, aspectual shape. What he means by that is the following. When you represent an object as something, you don't pick out all of its features, all of its actual features. So I have a picture of a person sweeping here. Suppose I say, that's a broom. If I say that's a broom, I'm representing it as something. And what I'm doing is picking out a subset of its actual features. It's got the property of, for example, being good for sweeping. That's one of the things that makes a broom, right? So you pick out some of its features. Aptness for sweeping. Now, it has a handle. That's a handle. If it's a broom, that's a handle and those are bristles, right? So I've picked out some of its features as relevant. And I've left out other features. So suppose an aggressive raccoon comes up on your porch and you have to get it away. Well, suddenly, this is no longer a handle. It's an excellent thing for jabbing small, angry mammals, right? So now it's a weapon. Yeah? So its properties as a weapon were not picked out by calling it a broom. But it nonetheless has those properties. Anytime you call something a thing, you picked out some of its properties. This is a bottle. But it's also a percussion instrument if I bang on it in a rhythmic fashion, right? So representing as is to pick out some things as relevant and some things as not relevant. That means that once you're already at the level of representations, you've already made judgments about what's relevant. So if you already got representations going in the system, that presupposes the ability to pick out some things as relevant and ignore other things. So representations, this argument goes, can't be the level at which you're doing relevance realization, or at least it can't be the starting point for your ability to do relevance realization. You actually need to be doing relevance realization before you even get representations. So you have to have some sub-representational level of figuring out what's important. So when I say that's a bottle or that's a broom, I'm already doing relevance realization. So your theory is if it's framed in terms of representation, it's presupposing the thing it's supposed to explain. Okay, yeah.
So if this is kind of like the go-by approach, would you, if you grab the broom, you'd be pre-specifying that like this is also used for cleaning, but this also can be used as a weapon to attack raccoons with. This can be used as a weapon to like. It seems that you could solve it in that way. That there would be huge lists of how you could define a broom. Like,
Yeah.
kind of like the side-corp approach, just facts.
Well, it's not to say that you can't solve this. We must be able to solve it somehow, right? We somehow represent the world to ourselves in ways that make it useful to us. So it's that we do solve it. It's the issue is that you would need, in order to do this in a GoFi system, it seems really hard because you face combinatorial explosion. If you're going to represent all of the different aspects of a thing, so like bottle as percussion instrument, how many other things do you think I could use? Like it's a weapon, you can use it on a chessboard as the rook, on and on. So if it's in the GoFi approach, you would probably have to list all of those things, and now you hit combinatorial explosion. So mysterious how you do this from the GoFi approach, just because of all of the problems of relevance that we already talked about. But we clearly solve this. We clearly represent the world to ourselves, so there must be a way.
And then getting back to narrow level said simultaneous constraints.
Yep.
Satisfaction.
Yep.
You're still having to consider out of all of the possibilities. You're having to constrain out of all those possibilities.
Yep.
And both agree is a neural network of some type.
We agree.
Like, there has to be some finite limit of what makes that broom or those characteristics that you can assign to a broom.
Absolutely, and it's not that we have to, I mean, we clearly fail to do this a lot of the time, right? We don't always pick out all of the most relevant. Sometimes you can get it wrong when you think you know what's relevant and not. And yeah, we clearly do it in some finite way. Yeah, agreed, yeah. Okay, but I hope what this argument is meant to show you just is that you can't start at the level of representations. There's something more, there has to be something more basic. The level of relevance realization has to be more basic than representations. At least, like, you can maybe do it at this level as well, right? You can do it at the representational level, but you also have to be doing relevance realization before you even get representations. Yeah? Does that argument work for you? Good. Okay. I don't think Jerry Fodor's been disgraced. He's dead now, so there's not as much of a point in doing it, but anyway. Okay, so how about the computational level? Maybe we can describe relevance realization in terms of the logical properties of propositions. So rather than individual representations, maybe there's some fact about the structure of propositions that we can use. You're going to be unsurprised to hear me say that this isn't going to work either. For reasons that are actually fairly familiar to us by now, so we can kind of do this quickly, I hope. Here's Jerry Fodor's argument in the fantastic clapback title, "The Mind Doesn't Work That Way," to respond to soon-to-be disgraced Steven Pinker. That's my prognosis is, my prediction is, any day now. So Fodor says, you're probably not going to be able to deal with relevance in terms of the logical properties of a statement. And here's his argument. So here's a logical rule that everybody agrees on. A equals A. That is the identity. So equals is an identity, where you're identifying two things. And two things are logically identical if they have the same logical implications. So the identity, the logical identity of a proposition is defined by its implications. If you got the same implications, you're the same proposition. So far, so good? Okay. So, are the logical implications, is relevance contained within the logical implications of a sentence? That's the question. So, I've got a sentence, it's got a bunch of logical implications. The question is, do those logical implications contain the facts that make it relevant or not? And you got two options here. You could say, yes, the relevance of a sentence is contained in its logical implications. Well, that's hard. It's hard to maintain because logical implications are constant across contexts. That's kind of what logic is famous for. That's kind of why logic is useful, because it tells you what's true across contexts in a context-insensitive way. But relevance is context sensitive. So you can either somehow write in all possible contexts into the logical properties of the sentence, which is, I mean, if you think chess, the space of possible chess games is big, the space of possible contexts is unimaginably vast. Not just actual context, possible context. Every possible context has to be somehow crammed into the sentence to give it its logical identity. And there's no possible way that a finite agent could deal with that. Or you could do the slightly more sensible thing and say, no, the relevance isn't packed into the logical implications. The logical implications are just whatever it implies logically, A equals A, and that relevance somehow goes beyond the logical implications of the sentence. So Fodor thinks that we should do the second thing because that's the kind of, we can manage the logical implications of a sentence. Yeah.
So you brought up how things don't have to be binary in nature to be heavy or statistical.
Mm-hmm.
You do that for this logical implication. Can you do the die cast and say an A is an A 70% of the time or 30% of the time, right?
No, not with logic. Not with logic. Especially any kind of classical logic, it's either true or false. Identity is not a squishy thing in logic. So if what we're doing is, and Fodor's specifically thinking about the computational functionalist theory of mind, the GoFi theory of mind, where this type of logic they're talking about is like classical logic. So in logic, there's none of this squishiness. There's none of this statistical stuff. It's either identical or not identical. So, okay, so that's the argument for computational, the level of computation, at least logical manipulation of symbols, probably not going to be the level at which we do our theory of relevance realization. Ta-da. I think we've done most of the elements of that argument before, so this should be, if this feels familiar, that's good. Okay, here's another one. Last one, and I promise I'm going to say something that maybe I can not knock down. Maybe rules. So here's two things that a computational functionalist has to deal with, has to offer, or to work with. So you've got the tokens and the propositions, the properties of propositions. You've also got the rules for manipulating those propositions. So maybe we can find relevance realization in the rules that operate on propositions. To knock this down, we're going to go to a really old argument from Wittgenstein. There's Wittgenstein again, looking not his happiest, but so he gives us his argument about rules. It's actually a very general argument. It's not to do with relevance realization at all. It's just this interesting fact about rules. Wittgenstein points out, I mean, he's writing in the 50s, so we hadn't started any of this stuff yet. Wittgenstein points out the following curious thing about rules. A rule does not contain the criteria for its application. So rules don't tell you how and when to apply the rule. So here's an example. Here's a rule that here's a moral rule that I hope you all attempt to follow. Be nice to people. It's a good rule. I recommend it. If you haven't tried it, try it today. But notice how hard that rule is to apply, and how the rules, the ways in which you should apply the rule are not contained within the rule. It's a short rule, be nice to people, four words, right? But is the way that I should be nice to you as students the same way that I should be nice to my parents? No. It's very different kinds of being nice, isn't it? There's very different ways of being nice. The way that you're nice to somebody sitting beside you on the bus is very different than the way that you would be nice to somebody that you're talking with on the internet, right? Being nice, the ways in which you should be nice, the way to apply that rule is in no sense contained in the rule itself. Yeah?
Does that include like also like a program? Since a program is kind of a set of rules, like a program does not have a description of when it should be applied to something.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. So this is absolutely right. There's nothing in the program that tells you when it's a good idea to run the program. And there's nothing, this is the problem with heuristics as a complete answer to the question of how we do problem solving. There's nothing in the heuristic that tells you when it's a good idea to use the heuristic. And you say, well, I'll just have another rule to tell me when to use the rule and how to use it. What's the problem there? Well, that rule doesn't tell you how to use that rule, so you need another rule. Another rule, and another rule, and another rule. So there's a kind of infinite regress. We, the intelligent agents, are the ones who figure out how and when to apply rules. This is Wittgenstein's point. The rules don't tell you how to behave. You decide how to use the rule. Yeah?
For the program analogy, couldn't you just write a manual?
Write a manual. I mean, you should have a manual. But having recently put together some IKEA furniture, I can tell you that even having a manual doesn't tell you everything you need to know about like you need to know how to use the manual now. I tell you, I had to take a whole bed apart and put it back together upside down. So I have a PhD, goddammit. Like I'm officially not a dumb person, but I struggle to use the IKEA put the bed together manual, and so I needed a manual for the manual. I needed instructions on how to use the manual. So you again get the infinite regress. At some point, you just need to. At some point, I think what you have to say is that you're not using rules exactly. That you're using intelligence, or something like that. No. Okay. Okay. So enough of saying bad things about ideas. Let's say some good things about some ideas. That'll be nice for a change, won't it? This class is a lot of dumping on really smart people's ideas. It's kind of depressing, but here's an idea that I think is right. So instead of a property of the world, why not think about relevance as a kind of cognitive commitment? There's a quote from the philosopher William Smith: "The road to success is through commitment." Okay. This leads us to think of relevance realization as a kind of economic question. That's economic not in the money sense, but in the biological sense. It's very funny to me that nobody laughed at philosopher William Smith. I enjoyed that very much. Okay. Okay. So we should think about relevance realization as deciding where and when to spend cognitive resources. That's maybe the right framework for thinking about this. What you do when you decide something is relevant is decide to spend some of your limited time and energy on it. So what we should think about this, maybe the right structure for thinking about this is in terms of, in some sense, bioeconomics. That's the kind of framework in which we should think about relevance realization. That's the proposal. And to deal with some of the problems that we just talked about. So I just tried to show you that, like, look, it can't be at the level of representations. It's got to be more fundamental than that. But of course, relevance realization can't just happen at the smallest levels either. It's got to happen at the broadest levels as well. So what we need is scale-free bioeconomics. Let me try to talk through what I mean by that. So to be scale-free is to happen at the very small and the medium and the large and the very large, right? It's happening at all scales, yeah? And notice, for example, that the economy does this. Our actual economy is self-organized in a scale-free way. So there's no single person who decides how much things cost in general, right? There's nobody, I mean, and I'm grateful for this because anytime in history when we've tried to do that, a lot of people starve to death. Like that's a very regular historical connection between just somebody on the top of society deciding how much things cost and everybody at the bottom starving. So be grateful that we currently have a system where small scale interactions determine small scale facts about the economy. So whether you go to your local convenience store and buy a bag of chips drives how many chips that the local convenience store buys. And the cost to them determines how much you pay. Now, that small scale interaction is self-organizing in the sense that it's a meeting of supply and demand, right? The amount of supply, the amount of demand at that specific location determines the cost. Now, that interacts with the medium scale, right? So the amount of convenience stores buying bags of chips determines how many chips the good people at Lay's produce and how much they're charging for it. That medium scale interacts with the very large scale. So like the wellness of the Lay's Chips Corporation affects the wellness of the economy as a whole. So like the small scales are self-organizing, the medium scales are self-organizing, interacting with the small scales. The medium scales are self-organizing and interacting with the very large scales. The whole thing is self-organizing. And it's self-organizing at multiple different layers simultaneously. And this is it's sort of magical, it's sort of terrifying. When the economy's going well, the government will tell you that it's their doing. Of course, governments are actors in the economy. They do stuff in the economy like every other actor, but they're not in charge of the economy. They're not running it, which is why it's sort of irrational for us to blame them when it's going badly, because they didn't decide for there to be a recession, right? Like they can do some things, but nobody's running the economy, at least in Canada, because we have a market economy. So market economies self-organize in a scale-free way. And the suggestion is that your brain is doing something similar with cognition. That is, your brain is self-organizing in a scale-free way to maximize some bioeconomic metrics, right? There's some kind of, mentioned before, cost and benefits. So you somehow your brain is tracking somehow the costs and benefits of various cognitive operations at a whole bunch of different levels and trying to find the best bioeconomic deal for itself. That's broadly the picture that I'm trying to, so this is all, okay, this is not coming from me, this is all from the reading from today, Verveake et al. This is their theory of relevance realization. And I'm simplifying it quite a bit because it's a dense paper, but this is I take it this is the basic idea. Okay, so we're still on like what kind of theory we need. Let's actually get into the theory, which looks something like this. You probably suppose that you are one thing, but they're going to suggest that you're actually a kind of swarm of machines. We're all a machine swarm, is the proposal. Biologically, you're certainly like a couple of trillion tiny animals who have gotten together to work towards a common good. The suggestion is that cognitively, we're the same. We're a whole bunch of tiny little cognitive machines that are not independently all that intelligent. Independently, each one of them is just a heuristic. So each of these little cognitive machines that we're made up of, they suggest, is a heuristic that runs a little rule for dealing with some type of problem. Probably there are machines within machines. So like when I'm walking, I've got a machine that makes my whole leg go forward. There's probably a little machine that makes my ankle go, and a machine that makes my knee go. And those are parts of the make the leg go machine, which is part of the overall walking machine. And so each of these little machines is a heuristic problem solver that deals with some kind of specific problem. and you're a swarm of them. And you're a swarm of them that's in some sense undergoing a type of natural selection. A type of natural selection. Machines are being added, machines are being removed, precisely to the extent that they give a good cost to benefit ratio. So if a heuristic is doing its job well and is efficient, then it gets to stay and gets called upon more often. And if a heuristic is not doing its job well, it doesn't get to stay. There's a kind of fitness constraint put on the machine swarm. You are in an ecology of machines, of tiny little machines, undergoing a form of natural selection. Yeah?
Has anyone figured out what the fitness constraint is?
Yes. That's the next slide. Well, I mean, figured out, they got a theory. They got a theory. And it's the following. So, here are two constraints. So recall natural selection is this sort of dynamic interplay of two constraints. Here is their proposal for how the constraints, the sort of fitness of the machines are determined. What you want is the right balance, they claim, between generality and specificity. So that a heuristic can be more general or more specific. And of course, you want to be, in general, a general problem solver. Right? You want to be able to deal with all kinds of different problems. You don't want to just sort of like specialize on one tiny specific thing. That's a recipe for disaster, for only being able to solve one type of problem. But often, specialists outperform generalists. So if your job is to pound nails, a hammer is a specialist tool for doing that, and it's really good at it. It's really good at it. I wouldn't want to, those little multi-tools? I would not want to try to pound nails with one of those little multi-tools. They're useful for a bunch of different things, but if you have the time and space to have like a complete set of tools that are specialized to their jobs, those are going to be much better at the task. And we saw this with something like this with the no free lunch theorem, which I think I talked to you about a little bit, where a heuristic is like this. So the more specific a heuristic is to one very particular task, the more efficient you can make it. You can make it super efficient at that extremely specific task. But of course, you don't want to be, as an overall agent, hyper specialized. You want the capacity to be somewhat general. But you also want to be efficient, right? Your brain is constantly trying to be as efficient as it possibly can. So there's this kind of trade-off between generality and specificity. So, generalization can be thought of as a kind of data compression. I don't know how well you can see the red line that goes through this blue dots from the back of the room, but we talked about this with the wake-sleep algorithm, where there's a red line going through these dots, and it's much simpler to represent the red line than it is to represent the complete set of dots. Right? So, and in some sense, that red line is a generalization of the data. It tells you, for example, what happens between the dots. When you haven't got any dots, it gives you some guesses about what's happening between them. It gives you some guesses about what would happen beyond the dots. Right? So you're compressing data and you're generalizing the data. That's certainly something that you want to do a lot of the time. You want to extract the invariant features of your environment. You want to know what's the same across changes so that you can predict what's going to happen next. But you also want to get the details right? You also care about, like when you draw a line of best fit, you're not hitting every dot. Right? You're allowing some of the dots to be like, I'm just going to forget that this one is, look at there's some dots in the middle here, way up above the line. And you're just saying, forget about those. And in your life, you can't let yourself do that all the way. You can't be like, well, generally speaking, my significant other, doesn't care about birthdays. That's not a detail. You do need to retain a bunch of the details of your life, right? You need the specifics, and you need to be able to deal with specific situations specifically a lot of the time. And I hope that you can see that these two things are kind of in tension. There's a kind of there's a kind of trade-off relationship between being specific and being general. And that you need both a lot of the time. Yep, yep.
Is there a difference between particularizing and kind of variable specialization? Is this what this is?
So particularizing is specializing in some sense. Yeah, yeah. Okay. So you got this trade-off relationship between generalizing and fitting to the environment, between getting the broad picture, getting the overall sense of things, and getting something very specifically right. And that trade-off is part of what sort of determines what, the theory goes, what machines get retained in your sort of life. So there must be some, this is the, in some sense, the what's being optimized by the bioeconomic sort of factors, right? So what you want is the best reward. So what you're constantly trying to fit, you're constantly going back and forth between specialization and generalization. And what you're trying to optimize is finding the right level of generalization for the getting the most efficient representation that gets you the best reward. So the easiest representation to use. So of course it's much easier to keep the generalized version in your head. It requires less attention to detail, but you lose the efficiency or the kind of like the correct details of the situation. A nice metaphor comes from evolution again. So evolution does this as well. Lots of species specialize to a food source. I think pandas just eat bamboo shoots, right? They just eat bamboo shoots. They're highly specialized diets. And that means that they can get very, very efficient at eating and digesting bamboo shoots. They don't have to deal with anything else. They don't have to deal with like weird random foodstuffs in their environment. And that makes them very efficient at using bamboo shoots. But then of course, if the bamboo goes away, so do the pandas. That's worrying. We are fairly general. We are generalists in terms of our diet, at least. We can eat all kinds of things and digest it and get some food energy out of it. That means that we're less efficient at digesting any of the particular things that we eat, right? So we're not as tuned up to any specific food source as the panda is to their bamboo shoots, but we have this much broader range of things that we can eat. Yeah. So what you trade off is efficiency and resiliency. Efficiency and resiliency. The bamboo eating panda is super efficient, but not resilient to changes in its environment. And we're kind of the opposite. We're not that efficient, but we are very resilient to changes in our food sources. So, and this is the kind of evolutionary equivalent of doing this generalizing versus fitting thing. Are you going to have heuristics that are very good across contexts, in which case they're very robust? If the problem that you're facing changes, you want a very general heuristic. But if you want to be as efficient as possible at dealing with a specific type of problem, then you want a very specific, very fitted heuristic. So you've got this kind of machine swarm, and it's doing this sort of optimization between these two extremes. That's the suggestion. And what they say is that this operates via opponent processing. So opponent processing is when you've got one process that's trying to shut down another process, and this process is trying to shut down the first process. This is the most sort of familiar example is probably your sympathetic and parasympathetic systems. So your sympathetic system is the one that, I can never remember which one is which. So, right, so parasympathetic is the one where you're like relax, digest, and repair. And sympathetic is where you're activating your energy sources, your adrenaline's going, you're ready to fight or flight, you're awake and aware. And the more that the sympathetic system is active, the more it shuts down the parasympathetic. So if a predator appears in your environment, the sympathetic nervous system says, all right, we're not digesting anymore. Forget about digesting, we're not in repair mode. All of that is done now. We are running away. That's what we're doing. Right? Every single calorie in this body is now dedicated to running away. And similarly, when the parasympathetic system says, look, I'm tired, so suppose you're in a quiet, safe place, it says, look, I'm tired, I'm shutting down all of this like be inactive stuff. So your muscles are going to get kind of loose and lazy, you're not going to be very acute in your perceptions, you're going to slow down, hopefully you'll go to sleep. So these two systems are constantly trying to turn the other one off. And your level of arousal is basically constantly being tuned by how important each system thinks it is at that moment. You don't want this to just split the difference, right? You don't want this to just average out and say, I'm just going to be 50% awake my whole life, right? That's a very poor strategy. What you want is for these two systems to be tuning their level of arousal precisely to the circumstances that you're in, and they do this using opponent processing. Okay, so I want to return now to the efficiency versus resiliency thing. So efficiency is how much you can do with how little, and resiliency is how you can, in some sense, think of it as long-term efficiency or efficiency across contexts or robustness. So resiliency is how good you are, how efficient you are when things change. And I've put up a picture of our friend Ronald here because there was a kind of movement in the 1980s in America for efficiency. Corporate America decided that efficiency was the best thing in the world. And what they did was cut every single job that wasn't absolutely necessary for the company as it existed at that time. So everybody worked as hard as they could all the time. There was no extra people hanging around. They cut out everything that they didn't need right then. The phrase was cut the fat, which is a very telling phrase because if you don't have fat, you die. Fat is how your body is resilient against perturbations, right? So they got very, very efficient. A lot of people made a lot of money in the 80s based on this model, right? Increasing efficiencies. And everybody was working their faces off. Everybody had exactly as much work as they could possibly do, and there was no inefficiency. And then what happens? And then literally anything happens. Like one of your workers gets sick, and there's nobody else who's there. Everybody's working maximum. Nobody can take up the slack, right? So your system chokes on the smallest, gets a little pebble in it, and your system chokes because you sacrificed all of your resiliency for efficiency, right? There is no living thing on the planet that is organized this way. We trade off efficiency for resiliency. Living things care a lot about efficiency. Don't get me wrong. It's not like we're just like, who cares? We're trying to get the most we can out of every single calorie that we take in. We always try to maximize our efficiency, but we built in resiliency as well. So like you have 2 kidneys. Why? Why? That would never pass corporate review, would it? What are you doing with 2 kidneys? Tim here is living with just 1. He's fine. What do you need 2 for? We're keeping these things alive. Don't you know the kidneys cost money? Well, the reason you have 2 kidneys is for resiliency, because if you lose both of your kidneys, you're in deep, deep trouble, right? So that's why your body is spending all these extravagantly wasting calories keeping 2 kidneys going. It's for resiliency. So what we need is some kind of balance between efficiency and resiliency. I mean, the good news is that everybody learned their lesson and we're no longer obsessed with efficiency. People get days off and we've got lots of time to breathe and relax. Okay. So anyway, yeah. Okay, so this is the trade-off that they think that they're doing. This is the kind of economic trade-off. Well, in some sense, the trade-off is, are you accomplishing your goals? And then the heuristics that you're using are moving back and forth between efficiency and resiliency, between compression and particularization. It's broadly the picture that they're giving. So they don't at any point in the paper say swarm of machines. That's kind of my phrase. But I think it pretty much accurately gets what they're suggesting. These machines act out heuristics. That is, these machines act out ways of solving problems that more or less get what's going on, that give you a better than average chance of solving whatever situation that you're in. And the swarm undergoes opponent processing, shifting between general heuristics and particularized heuristics. So there's a kind of natural selection going on in the swarm where if you're getting a lot of benefits out of generalized heuristics for a given problem, those ones will proliferate. If you're getting sometimes you need more specific ones. If you're getting a lot of rewards out of more specific heuristics, those ones will proliferate. And the whole system tunes itself in just the same way that natural selection tunes populations to be fitted to its environment. And furthermore, this is happening at every level in the brain. So for the very small scale, for the very tiny heuristics that let you, for example, represent this is a bottle. That's a very tiny heuristic. And you've got very large heuristics like how should I live my life? Or what's a good way of dealing with my human relationships? Those are like large scale heuristics that you've got. And they're kind of embedded in each other in a hierarchy, in a scale-free hierarchy. That's more or less the picture. Yeah?
You brought up how evolution doesn't account for what factors explicitly are selected to make an organism successful and fit.
Yeah, the theory of evolution does not include anything about what counts as fit.
If we're to mechanize this approach,
Yeah.
and we don't have an understanding of what factors make something fit or what makes something bioeconomic in the sense of reasoning, how do we hope to actually build one?
Do you have a response to this?
I mean, we have simple evolutionary models that we simulate.
Yeah.
I think you just put in the same sort of like energy constraints and then put it in environment and just let it go.
How many, what I'm getting at, like you put in how many of those energy constraints, but how many of those do you need? What do you base those energy constraints on? How much time you spend on certain tasks, whether or not you can get, more energy from that
Okay.
task, the other guys.
Yep.
Component processing, what is the weight of one task versus another task?
Yep. So those are serious questions, and I don't think that in the paper that they answer them, but I think it's not impossible to see how you could think of answers. So you just threw out a couple of answers. For example,
I won't talk to every class.
okay. Of course. You can do things like how much processing power does this require? That's something that your brain seems to be constantly tracking. Our brains are profoundly, fundamentally lazy organs. We're trying to do as little work as they can in order to deal with the problems that they're facing. And that's exactly how you want them to be, right? You want your brain to try to be, again, I'm not saying anything bad about efficiency. You want efficiency. You need efficiency. So your brain is constantly tracking how much work is it to deal with this problem, and then how rewarding is it for me to have solved it. So those are the broad descriptions, and is that enough to mechanize? No. What I just said is not enough to write a computer program. But I think that it's reasonable to suppose that there might be a bunch of different ways of filling out those questions. So the way our brain does it isn't necessarily the way that any intelligent agent whatsoever has to do it. If you built a robot, presumably its metrics for energy expenditure will be radically different than ours. Ours are based in glucose expenditure. Like our brain runs on sugar. How much sugar did I have to burn? A robot, unless it's weirdly fueled by Gatorade, would be electricity. How much electricity, or how many run cycles, or something like that. So I think you could fill that out in very different ways and still retain the broad outlines of this theory. Is that reasonable? Yeah. But please, we're happy to talk more after class. Yeah?
Did they consider how consciousness arises within this system?
Okay, so that's Thursday's reading. Yeah. So right now we're just trying to do cognition and relevance realization. On Thursday, I'm going to make the argument based on, again, a paper by some work by Verveake, but also by, what's the global workspace theory guy? Can't remember his name. The global workspace theory. Bars and Shanahan, got it. Bars and Shanahan make this argument that what consciousness is for being a relevance filter in some sense. So there'll be a few hours to kind of flesh that out. But we're going to get there on Thursday. Yeah, yeah. Okay. So that's a kind of picture of at least what sort of theory might be the answer to the question, how do we do relevance realization? There's several stops that you might get off on for this train. You might say, yeah, what we need is a theory of relevance realization, but I disagree with everything that you said after that. You might say, yeah, what we need is a theory of dynamical self-organizing relevance realization that's sort of like evolution, and that involves the different constraints that get used for, changing the kind of like system over time. But I disagree with everything you said after that, and so on and so on. So there's like a number of sort of what we've been doing is narrowing in on what broad type of theory. We say a dynamical theory. Within that, we need something like a bioeconomic theory. Within that, we say, here are the constraints. You need the trade-off of particularization and generalization. That's the kind of way of filling out what the constraints actually are. And then you get more, in the paper itself, they get even more specific about how they think they're like mathematically related to, those constraints are mathematically related. So, broadly, that's the idea. And I think my confidence in this theory is maximum at the most broad scope. And then as it goes in, I'm like less and less qualified to even assess it. But I think that it's hopefully convincing that this is at least the right kind, at least potentially a kind of theory that could solve this problem. That what we shouldn't conclude like Verveake and Chiappi did in 1997, that this is a hopeless endeavor that we should just all give up on and go find more productive things to do with our lives. Rather, maybe this is a way forward, and there are substantial questions to be answered here. Like we don't have, for example, a way to mechanize this just yet. So we're probably at the analysis stage, moving towards formalization. We're not at mechanization yet. But maybe we got the right basic moving parts, which are a dynamical system undergoing various constraints. And maybe we got the right way of formalizing the specific dynamical constraints that we're dealing with. Yeah?
I'm just curious, is this a widely accepted notion now?
Nothing in cognitive science is widely accepted. So the parts there are a bunch of parts of this that are widely accepted. For example, the centrality of relevance to understanding cognition, that's a very much a growing, and this is not specific to Vervaeke's work at all. That's a kind of broad consensus that something about this is crucially important. His specific proposal, it's getting some play, but I wouldn't say it's broadly accepted yet. Yeah. It's a fair question. Okay. So, but there's some more questions that we should be concerned about here. For example, how does it know what the right balance is? So the system is trying to find a dynamic balance between various constraints. How does it know what that is? Furthermore, what is the right balance? Where do the facts of the matter come from in determining the correct balance? That's a question that so far I haven't really said much about. So I'd like to address that now. And I think another part of kind of third wave cognitive science gives us some really nice tools for dealing with it, at least on the metaphysical level. So the metaphysical level in the sense of what determines the facts about what the right balance is. And then there's a biological question about how your body tracks those facts. So there's a question about, what makes something the appropriate way of realizing relevance, and then a question about how you biologically track that. So let's deal with the first question. What sets the facts? What makes it true that something is relevant or irrelevant? And I think that we can get what the right balance of generalization and particularization is. I think we can get some purchase on that question by talking about autopoiesis. So shall we plow on? I got not tons and tons more, but we'll go beyond our usual 50 minutes if that's okay. So this is going to be, prepare yourself, there's some heavy stuff coming. So the enactivists like Maturana, Varela, and Thompson propose what they call the continuity of life and mind. And this is another, it's a sort of independent branch of third wave cognitive science that I haven't really talked much about. But what they want to do is ground the sense of what's important in the type of body that you've got. So the metaphysical facts about what's relevant to you as a, like what's as a matter of fact, independently of what you're thinking, what is relevant to you is set by your structure as a living thing. And they think that this establishes a kind of what they call a deep continuity of life and mind. What they claim is every living thing is in some sense cognitive. And every cognitive thing is in some sense living. It's a pretty bold claim. It's a pretty bold claim. So we're not going to do tons of this stuff. Thompson's book Mind and Life is a really good place to start if you want to read about this. But consider a single-celled organism. A single-celled organism, like a paramecium, will swim towards food and away from poison. Now, it hasn't got a very fancy apparatus for deciding which is which. It's kind of hardwired, right? Nobody's saying that paramecia are like super duper smart. Nobody's confused about that point. They're pretty simple, they're pretty mechanical. However, they do reliably go towards goals and away from peril. That's a fact about single-celled organisms, and they regulate themselves in ways such that they can do that. But what makes something food and what makes something poison to the paramecium? Well, their answer is something like this. So let me go back to this diagram. So it's grounded in their definition of life, actually. So this is the life and mind continuity hypothesis. The enactivists have a definition of what they think living is, well, what it is to be a living thing. And it's roughly encapsulated in this weird kind of cult-like looking diagram. So there's a few things. Every living thing, so their autopoiesis is their definition of life. And to be autopoietic is to have the following properties. One, you make a boundary between yourself and the rest of the universe. So there's some semi-permeable boundaries. You have to be able to exchange matter and energy because all living things are far from equilibrium systems. So you're exchanging matter and energy, but selectively, right? It's not just everything passes through. You let good things pass through and bad things not. So you've got a semi-permeable boundary that you establish that is sort of distinguishes the insides from the outsides, you from the universe, okay? And that semi-permeable boundary and basically everything inside of it is built, bespoke by the system. So you're making your own parts. Autopoiesis literally translates to self-making. So you're making your own parts and you're doing it in a way such that you maintain that boundary. So the way that you're building your parts is specifically tuned up to make sure that you remain a unity, right? A unity separate from the universe. And you're furthermore, so that's the biggest circle is the semi-permeable boundary, the medium circle is the self-making, and this is the interaction between you and the universe. That squiggle's the universe. That's it, this squiggle. That's the whole universe. Okay, so these arrows are you regulating your interaction with the environment. So you're not only making your own parts in a way that maintains your unity, you're regulating the way that you're interfacing with the universe in order to maintain your unity and in order to maintain your ability to make your own parts. So you kind of got this causal, they call it causal closure and autonomy. That is, you're separate from the universe. You're a kind of, you're a little universe in and of yourself in the sense that you're making yourself and you're maintaining the difference between yourself and the rest of the universe. And they think that this goes all the way down to single-celled organisms. You can just anything that's alive meets those descriptions that I just gave you. and anything that doesn't isn't alive. Single-celled organisms have this. So they literally have a semi-permeable boundary. They make all their own parts. They swim towards food and away from poison. Yeah?
Is shaky then, to a sense, alive? Like,
No. We made Shaky's parts.
like he has like an internal sense of self. He's like avoiding things to a degree, like.
So he didn't make his own boundary. He didn't make his own parts. He doesn't regulate. If you told Shaky, go drive off that cliff, he totally would.
This like single cellular organism didn't make its own part. It was born. And
No, it does. It does.
It was divided from another like organism,
Uh-huh.
and then through its eating interaction with the environment, okay, then it's doing
Yeah.
things. But like
Yeah.
Shaky, okay, was born by us. It is then interacting with the rest of the
There's no robot on the planet that makes its own parts. There's nothing except living things that make their own parts.
So this has to be rooted in self-replication.
It's self-making. Yeah.
So not in the sense of like you're self-making in terms of your own goals or objectives, but like actually your own body.
Yeah, literally. Yeah.
It's something like fire, where it's like you have, I mean, like you can have the learning environment, like you can or you can occur naturally. And like that.
So fire's got the property of being self-regenerating. So fire does continue to create more fire. But what it doesn't do is regulate its interaction. So it doesn't generate the boundary between itself and the rest of the universe. And it doesn't regulate its own interactions in order to keep itself in an adaptive way to keep itself going. So fire never in the history of the universe has fire decided, well, I'm just going to burn a little bit because I need to save my fuel to last longer. That's the kind of thing a living thing does. We decide to regulate ourselves in ways that can keep us going, but fire just goes. Yeah? So it's not doing the careful regulation of its relationship with the universe, and it's not doing the careful internal regulation that's characteristic of living things. And all living things do both of those things. Okay, so what does this have to do with relevance? So I hope that's mildly interesting, at least in and of itself. It's a fascinating branch of cognitive science because they're trying to ground cognition in life itself. But what does this have to do with relevance? So their argument is that the conditions, so being autopoietic in some sense generates a fact of the matter about what's good and bad for you. What's good is what helps you maintain yourself as an autopoietic unity, and what's bad is what threatens to dissolve you. So in some sense, once you're autopoietic, once you're self-making, there becomes a fact of the matter about what's relevant to you, at least in a very basic, simple sense. There becomes a fact of the matter about what's important. Yeah?
Kind of coming back to the example, like that of fire, of the greenhouse effect. So as the fuel gets burned in the upper atmosphere, gets hotter, and as the upper atmosphere gets hotter, like the things on Earth begin to get hotter and release more gases into the upper atmosphere, and then it becomes a greenhouse effect. Self-reinforcing. It has no sense of what's important to itself, but it's persisting. It's keeping itself going.
So just feedback loops that persist are not sufficient to be autopoietic. Again, they're not making their own parts, and they're not regulating their interaction with. There's no semi-permeable boundary there, and there's no seemingly purposeful attempt to keep itself going. So something threatens the wild feedback loops that are generating global warming. Global warming doesn't care. It's not trying to stay warm, fortunately. Some people attribute this property to the overall biosphere. This is the Gaia hypothesis, the idea that life as a whole is sort of regulating itself. Lots of debate about that. I don't have a strong opinion one way or the other. But for our purposes, the point is just that this sets the facts of the matter, at least in a basic sense, of what's relevant. It makes something important or unimportant, good or bad, even at the level of single-celled organism. So maybe this gives us the metaphysical fact. I mean that just in the sense of like, it's a mind-independent fact about a paramecium that some things are poison for it and some things are food. The paramecium, of course, doesn't know that. It's just hardwired. So it's not intelligent in the sense of human-level intelligence. It might be cognitive in the sense that it's got some skills, some ability to navigate its environment, but it's hardwired. We, on the other hand, are the ones who have to like figure out what's relevant because we're not hardwired with what's relevant for us. But maybe that's sort of the basis, the kind of factual basis on which you can begin to decide what's relevant. So what keeps you going is at least minimally what you would consider relevant. Okay. So Verveeke et al.'s theory has some predictions and some postdictions. Postdiction is just a thing that you say your theory entails that we already knew was true. So that's a nice thing. It's, it's not very impressive, but it's a nice thing to happen. If your theory has implications that you already know are true, that's nice. Predictions are better, but postdictions are good too. So he argues that, or they argue that what we should see is compression and particularization in the brain. And maybe, in fact, we do. And maybe we've already talked about this in terms of neural synchrony. So the argument that they make is that a whole bunch of neurons coming into sync is reasonably interpreted as data compression, as generalization. You're saying these bits of information are all related to each other and sort of systematically related. And maybe desynchronization is correlated to particularization. That's the thought. And the ability to generalize and particularize would then correspond to being in that critical state that we talked about. So where your brain seems to hover just on the edge of going into and out of synchrony. Right? We seem to be exquisitely tuned up to stay right on the edge there. And if that correlation is right, if what they're saying is synchrony corresponds to the generalization phase, desynchronization to the particularization phase, then what that tells us is that our ability to be intelligent is a product of being right at that critical phase. So they interpret this fact about our brain as a kind of postdiction of the theory. How about predictions? So if they're right, so that's a fact about how the brain fires. They make a prediction about how the brain wires. The prediction is that what we should see is the brain wiring in a way that best balances resiliency and efficiency. Now, turns out, after the paper was published, work has been coming out that seems to confirm that. And hang on, we're going to do a little bit of what's called network theory to explain this. It's very brief, but so network theory is a theory about just the mathematical properties of networks in general. It's nothing to do with brains in particular, but it can apply to brains. Here's 3 different types of networks. This is a regular network, this is a random network, and this is a small world network. So Stephen Strogatz is a fantastic writer, same guy as the Sync book that I recommended earlier. He's got this wonderful analogy for thinking about the properties of these different types of networks. So imagine each one of these dots is a person in a social network. You're one of these dots, and you got a great band. You got a noise band. You just play 45 minutes of droning guitars, and you want all of your friends to know about it because you're like that. So now ask yourself, how do you want the word to spread? What kind of network do you want to be in for everybody to find out about your shoegaze drone noise band? If you're in this regular network, you can see that the connections are short distance, right? It's very regular. It's very resilient because if you knock out one of these connections, there's 2 more every time. But it's not very efficient because if this is you and you want somebody all the way on the top of the network to hear about your band, it's got to go through a whole bunch of steps. And people are very unreliable. you know, if you lose one of these connections because somebody's not answering their phone or isn't interested in your band, it's much harder to get the signal all the way around the network. So it's very resilient, but it's not very efficient. Compare that to the random network, which is very efficient. This is, I mean, and these are sort of provable mathematical facts about these types of networks. The random network, the average distance between any two nodes is much, much lower than the regular network. So if you just let the connections happen randomly, it's much more efficient. Like how many steps it takes for any person to hear about your band is much shorter. However, it's much less resilient. So statistically speaking, the effect of knocking out any one connection makes it much less likely that the signal is going to get through. So taking connections out of the random network makes it much more likely that the whole thing is going to fail or the signals aren't going to propagate. Yeah, yeah.
Do they have to be fixed?
No.
I was gonna say, 'cause this sounds like Eaton's Boltzmann machines, which are circular like this, but they rewire themselves. And
Yep. Yep.
all they random.
Yep. And that's what your brain does. That's what your brain does. Okay, so the small world network is the best mix of those two. So it's mostly a regular network, but with a couple of long distance connections. So you know one guy who's in the metal scene, and he can tell all of his metal friends about your noise band. And you know one person in the K-pop scene, and they can tell all their K-pop friends about your noise band. So most of the connections are regular, short distance, but a couple of long distance connections. And this makes the average distance between any two nodes low, like in the random network, but it's resilient like the regular network. So it's this nice, a small world network is this really nice balance of resiliency and efficiency. And after the Verveake et al. Paper comes out, a bunch of data starts coming in to show that your brains seem to tend to organize around the small world network structure. So that suggests that your brain is wired in a way that the connections are such that it's balancing efficiency and resiliency. So that's the prediction, at least somewhat confirmed. Okay, so there it is. There's Verveake et al.'s theory of relevance realization. Hope you enjoyed it. That's the, and what we're going to do for our very last class next time is to think about, so I haven't brought this back to Qualia. We started talking about Qualia, and then we went on about pandas and noise bands. We're going to next time bring this back to the notion of things meaning something to us. So hopefully what we can do is somehow defeat the dualist and prove that we've defeated the notion that relevance we can't have a theory of relevance. Next time we're going to try to defeat the dualist by maybe cashing out what the subjective character of experience is like, why it is the way it is in terms of this relevance stuff. That's the Shanahan and Barr's global workspace hypothesis. Okay, thanks everyone.